Good evening, everyone. I'm Emily with the Miami University Alumni Association, and we are so thrilled to have you joining us tonight for one of our favorite traditions, a virtual wine tasting with the legendary Jack Keegan. As we kick off the summer season, what better way to celebrate than by raising a glass together, even if it's from afar? Though I know many of you already know the man of the hour, Jack Keegan is an instructor emeritus at Miami University and has been a part of the university for over 45 years. He teaches the always popular viticulture and enology course. And for those of you lucky enough to have taken it, I'm sure tonight brings back some fond memories. And for those of you who didn't, tonight is your chance to experience the magic. So quick reminder, if you are watching live, you can use the ask a question button at the bottom of your screen. I'll be keeping an eye on those throughout the tasting, so don't be shy. Send your questions my way, and I will pass them along to Jack. And with that, grab your glass, get ready, and take it away, Jack.
Great. Thanks, Emily. Good evening, all. I hope you are doing wonderfully well. I apologize. This is supposed to be the kickoff for summer, and it's not exactly summery temperatures. I actually sat in front of the fire with a book last night, which in fact was really fun, which is very, very odd to think of doing at the end of May. But I didn't mind one bit at all. So welcome all. Let's see. First of all, as usual, I will tell you what wines we are doing. I have both 22 and 23 of the Natura Sauvignon Blanc from Chile. And then it's a 24 Dow Vineyard Sauvignon Blanc from Paso Robles. 24 Craigie Range from Martinborough, North Zealand. And then the Maison Saint-Axe from Côte d'Axe de Provence in France. And then a Tude Wines Lyric Pinot Noir from Monterey County, and then the language of yes, Cuvée Cinsault from Central Coast. So that will be in fact very, very fun. You also know, of course, when I do this, I'm not going to make you listen to me and not have something to drink. So let's start with the first wine, shall we? This, of course, is the Natura. Let me get one. One nice thing, too, everything is screw cap tonight, so that makes it a little easier on everything, a little faster also in there. And so I'm going to start, in fact, with the 22. This is, in fact, sort of very interesting, in fact, to see. But here, let's start this. Screw caps certainly do make it easy, I know. We'll pour a bit. Again, if you can see, in fact, the color, nice, in fact, pale straw, probably many of you have it. One nice thing, wow, the aroma simply comes right out of the glass. And it was really very neat, in fact, to, have that wine. And of course, as usual, we swirl this wine. What it does, of course, is increase the amount of molecules in the air so you can smell it better. And in fact, give this wine a sniff. Nice and fresh. Maybe a little herbal at the same time. In fact, definitely herbs because it's got a little bit of a grip to it that's really nice. Yeah, almost a little rosemary. How interesting. And of course, if you taste this wine, I like to swirl it around a little bit and pull a little air through it. Dry, dry, but fresh, nice and herbal. Just really sort of nice for a warm summer evening, which in fact we will have eventually, at least here in Oxford. I know though, if you're in Texas, you're currently baking. So of course that does make a difference. Has a nice, long, very sort of herbal finish to it. Dry, fresh, clean, lemons, certainly there. Really very, very nice from that standpoint. What I'm going to do is I'm going to then, because some of you may have, in fact, I ended up going to our local store today and finding, in fact, that they had the 23. So those of you, let's make sure I picked the right one out. And so I wanted to make sure, and it's always interesting to see what the difference is in vintage. We talk about vintage, and the only thing vintage means is the grapes come from a certain year. And so I thought, it might be fun to try the two against each other. First thing I noticed is this wine is slightly lighter in color than the first one was. Not a whole lot, but as you can see, a little bit lighter there in color. And if I swirl and smell this wine, many of you, in fact, may have the 23. Very much the same. In fact, yeah, amazingly, in fact, alike. In that, maybe a little fresher, a little brighter. Yeah, but certainly still has very much the same characteristics, that very sort of herbal characteristics is there. And of course, if I taste this wine, Mm, yes, very, very much alike. What you expect to be, even though, well, we'll talk a little bit about those, some of this wine, etc., and sort of what about it and what goes on with this. Um, it's always interesting when I do these tastings. Um, Getting the information is sometimes pulling teeth is probably easier. I mean, it really is sometimes. In fact, and this was one of those examples, in fact, that I will tell you a little bit about that as we go through. But yeah, let's look at the slides. Um, this is, in fact, from the Central Valley. It's always nice to know where it comes from. So this is from Chile. And in fact, this is not very far from Santiago. And the Maipo, Colchagua, and the Mole, there at the end, are places, in fact, where probably most of the wines come from. Chile is very, very interesting because what you have is, of course, you have a coastal range, which in fact prevents a lot of the water from coming in. So much of this area is dry. In fact, much of this has to be dry farmed. And then, of course, what forms, of course, the border between Chile and Argentina are the Alps. The Alps. Oh my God, the Andes. Sorry about that. I'm moving to Europe, I guess. And so because of that, with the Andes, very, very high, and this is where the water comes from. Because, in fact, all the rivers, in fact, flow from the Andes and come down, in fact, to the south. It's also very interesting because of this, the soils in the Central Valley are, in fact, alluvial, which in other words means water-driven to a great extent, in fact, coming down, in fact, from the Alps, which is good because they tend to be fairly lean, which is, in fact, very good for Sauvignon Blanc. Doesn't have a lot of fertilizer in it, and so that works out well, and also good drainage. One thing that I talk about in class all the time is grapes really do not like to have wet feet. They require good drainage, and so very important, in fact, from that wines. Fairly modern winery, and by the way, this is, in fact, the winery is called Emiliana. They, in fact, are one of the largest biodynamic or organic wineries in Chile. By the way, I will say this about this. It's easier to have an organic winery in places like Chile or maybe in California than it would be in Ohio or certainly in France. And that's because it simply doesn't rain there very much. And of course, rain is what causes all of the problems with diseases and fungi, etc. And so if you don't have the rain, then you don't have the fungal problems. And so this, in fact, makes it a lot easier for them to do that. But this is the winery from this. The wine is brought into the United States by Banfi. Many of you may know, in fact, probably drank Riuniti at one point in time. But Banfi, of course, were Mariani brothers. They moved to America and were great importers of wine from Italy, but eventually, in fact, bought a fairly good amount of land in Italy. And so they, in fact, make a lot of Italian wines also. But they, in fact, import wine from all over the place. And this is one of the places. And so this is sort of under their name. But in fact, as far as I could tell and looking at everything, it comes from Emiliana. And so this Emiliana winery is, in fact, where this comes from. It's on some labels, but not on all of them. And certainly is not, actually, instead of interesting, the 22 does not say Emiliana, but the 23 does. I'll show you that later when it comes to the 4. So that's interesting to see that, in fact, it is from that winery with that. So again, some pictures, of course, you see how dry the soil is. And of course, you see the coastal range in the thing. Here's again another picture of the vineyards, in fact, that are there. Seem to be very nicely taken care of. Interesting that they should have posted this picture, because if you look to the right, you see that those vines have been hedged. The ones on the left haven't been hedged yet. They probably, in fact, were bringing the machinery down there. They cut off the ends of the vines because that's basically towards the end of the season, the useless part of the vine, and you don't want it to continue growing, and so you hedge it. So this, in fact, are very nicely, in fact, hedged vines that you can see in there. Again, a picture of very old vines, and this is probably, of course, in early spring, which, by the way, would be for them July, because in fact they're going into winter now as we're going into summer, and so July or August, and so this in fact is what it looks like, in fact, as spring is coming, in fact, in the southern hemisphere. By the way, you notice in the back you see, in fact, the wind machine, and this, of course, being in the valley, it helps prevent frost by using the inversion layer, the warmer air that's above, and they bring it down, and so this, in fact, can prevent frost. So that's what you're seeing, in fact, in that picture right there. This is 100% Sauvignon Blanc. From what they said from the Central Valley, organic grapes hand harvested in March, again, which, of course, in fact, now I know New Zealand had a very, very good again, their harvest, in fact, just finished. Australia seemed to also be fairly good. I haven't really checked with the other countries there in the Southern Hemisphere, but now their 2025s are already in vat. So they're already done. Stainless steel, selected yeast, low fermentation, what you expect. They leave it on the yeast for a while, but only aged in stainless steel for 3 months before released. This is, I thought that was also very interesting. 1% of all their sales support the Rodell Institute. God, I remember, in fact, from almost being a kid, organic farming, or I can't remember the name of the magazine right now, came from the Rodell Press. And they've been around for a very, very long time. They've been a major source of work in organic farming, etc. So, in fact, one of the percent of their sales actually goes into Rodell, which is very nice for them to do with all of that. This is, in fact, one of the things, no matter how much we think about organic grapes, which it is, they think, sometimes seems, anemic. In fact, this gentleman says, rounded mouthfeel, lots of lime and green kiwi flavors, a hint of herbal spiciness, which I think is certainly there, ending with a finishing crispness. So again, very, very nice wine. Very interesting, and a nice dry way to start the day. By the way, you may have noticed that I decided that I would focus a little on Sauvignon Blanc as a grape variety, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit also with things that are going on in the world. So speaking about what's going on in the world, let's talk about the world of wine. First of all, this is the time, it may not be a term that you're familiar with, but this is en primeur. En primeur, what happens is the 2024 vintage, of course, was picked in basically September, October. And it was interesting. I happened to be, as some of you know, I know it was terrible. I had to go to Bordeaux to redo my Bordeaux wine certification. And so I was there in October. One of the things I did in fact, I was in Paris before I went to Bordeaux. That was also just terrible. I bought a raincoat because it was supposed to rain the next 3 days. And in fact, I've actually been very pleased to read about the wines coming out of Bordeaux from this vintage. Because what happens is they make the wine, or actually, they pick the grapes, they make the wine, and of course, they use several different grapes in Bordeaux. And so each one of the grapes is vinified separately. So they'll have vats of Cabernet, they'll have vats of Merlot, they'll have vats of Cabernet Franc, etc. And so what happens is then, of course, the holidays come. And so then afterwards, in January, they start doing the blending for their first wine for the 2024 vintage. Then what happens is, typically in March or April, the people who are in the know of the wine world go there and they taste the wine out of barrel. And then what happens, and we're in the middle of it, then what happens is in Bordeaux, they then start selling the wine. And this is called en primeur. And you can buy, for example, if you go to Zacky's, or there are a couple other places I noticed, you can now buy, and actually the prices are not too bad, you can buy wine from the 2024 vintage. Now, you will not get that wine for at least 12 months, maybe as much as 18 months. But you can, in fact, do this. And in many cases, the prices will go up. And so you can get it at a bargain price. And I will tell you, because of between all the other upheavals going on in the world, the prices have dropped markedly. There are some wines that are now selling this year en primeur that, in fact, are half the price that they were 3 years ago in the 2022, 2 years ago in the 2022 vintage. Now, again, many of these wines are still very expensive, but I was actually very pleased. I was looking at some wines that I thought were very, very good. Again, more than I typically spend, but $40, $45 a bottle, which in fact for very good Bordeaux is not really that bad. My problem with buying anything, or even thinking about buying anything en primeur, is I'm not en primeur anymore. And so it's like, well, if I have to wait 10 more years, well, I guess I would still be alive, but I'm not going to place my bets, let's put it that way. So I will, in fact, not buy it. But in fact, I've actually told a couple of friends, this might be a good vintage. It's certainly better, and the prices are better. And the wines turned out much better because they had lots of rain last year. Sorry, I'm talking too much. I want to say one other thing, too. It was a unique project, too. I was looking at it with Cornell and NASA, using aerial imagery to detect signs of drought and diseases in vineyards, even before you can detect them yourself. It really is amazing what some of the technology. One of the things, in fact, when I taught horticulture, I told my students, and, you can certainly tell people, young people, that the crux, the combination between agriculture and horticulture and technology are just amazing. And the world is just amazing. In fact, I've got a couple things to show you here. This was also interesting. I just simply found this out 3 hours ago. And these are some articles were done. And here, let's face it, there's the very common saying, I cook with wine. Sometimes it goes into the food. And yeah, that's pretty much my motto in life. And so consequently, I've never really thought about this. But what they did was they did, in fact, some good science looking at how much of the alcohol stays in the dish that you're making after cooking. And look at this. If you just add at the very end, most of it will be there. But if it's flambéed, in other words, meaning when you add the wine and then you cook it for a little while, still 3/4 of the wine will be left there. Simmered for 15 minutes, we're down to 40. Simmered for an hour, we're down to 25. But even if you're making something like beef bourguignon or another stew, after 2.5 hours, 5% of the wine of the alcohol is still there. Now remember, that's 5% of the wine that you added. And so you have to think of it from that standpoint. Let me give you a good example. Let's see. When I made, now of course I cooked it for longer than 2.5 hours, but when I made beef bourguignon for my open house for class, I added 3 bottles of wine. And so then by the time I was done, there might have been a 1/4 bottle left in that entire thing. So a very, very small amount of alcohol. But that, in fact, is something I had no idea that it stayed that long, because alcohol has a much lower boiling point than water does. And so you would expect the alcohol to go off a lot faster. And they said it depends on whether you have the lid on it or a number of things like that. But I thought this was really interesting. And again, for those of you who cook and use wine and things, it's sort of interesting to know that there will be, because if someone has a real problem with alcohol, you then know, in fact, there will be some alcohol left in there. Again, unfortunately, some other things going on in the world of wine. I just happened to see this today. This was, in fact, May 20th. Terrible storms going on in Provence. And of course, we're having a wine from Provence tonight. And so this is just some horrible, horrible hail and flooding, etc., in a lot of Provence. Luckily, if it's hail, it's going to be real bad. If it's flooding like this, as long as there's good drainage, the grapes probably will not be too badly affected. But regardless, this is truly a shame and a real problem, in fact, for those people. So your heart sort of goes out to them for their difficulties in all of that. This is a nice picture. This is, in fact, I also saw today. They won. There's in fact, again, a Chilean wine company that, in fact, sort of has their picture of the year. And this, in fact, took place in California. And you can see, in fact, they're picking, in fact, actually at the Sanford and Benedict Vineyard, they're picking grapes at midnight because, of course, it's nice and cool. So that's Pinot Noir that you see going into the crate there, out of the crate, into the large gondola that's there. And so that's what grape picking looks like at midnight in California. Because, in fact, there's a lot of night harvesting that goes on with that, because the grapes are cool, there's less bugs, it's cooler, and so, in fact, this is what goes on with this. I always have to laugh. One of my former students was a TA. He now, in fact, has a very, very nice job. He's a winemaker, in fact, in Napa. But when he was doing the harvest internship, they wouldn't let him pick. He wasn't good enough. He could only drive the truck with the lights. So I thought that was really, in fact, very good to see. So this is, in fact, what you're seeing on that one. This is interesting, too. Some of the new things that they were talking about. These are smart traps, infield sensors that give growers a daily idea of insect pressure and crop conditions. In fact, in this is, again, new technology. This is also, look at this, Spornado Sampler Passive Spore Trap detects crop diseases, pathogens in the air long before the symptoms begin to appear on the plant. So again, this gives the viticulturist just one more thing to, in fact, prevent disease in the vineyard. So I thought that was really interesting to see. This is also interesting, and I had another one that I did not put on, but you can see most of our wine, in fact, in the first quarter, in other words, basically January through March of 2025, came from France, followed by Italy. I was surprised, New Zealand, then Spain, Australia, Argentina, and Chile, Portugal, Canada, Germany, Israel, and then, of course, going down to very, very small amounts from a number of other countries. So I thought that was very interesting, in fact, to see also where wine is coming from. And, of course, I was also looking at the 25 versus the 24. And, of course, because of all the upheaval and who knows what's going on when it comes to tariffs, etc., there's been, in fact, a lot less wine coming into the United States from other countries in the first quarter than last year with all of that. And this, you may not understand that it was there, but it's a great idea. Most people don't know that the major problem with wine when it comes to its environmental impact is the glass bottle. And in fact, it drives me crazy. It's really great. There's a wonderful blog called Vinography, and Alder Yarrow is his name. And in fact, he basically calls out about the utterly stupid heavy bottles that, in fact, that are there to make you get the idea, oh, this wine's really good because it's in a heavy bottle. There's no real correlation. But in fact, this was, in fact, this one company reducing, in fact, the number of people. I know Kendall Jackson has more and more people, in fact, are going to lighter bottles. And this is actually lighter bottles, even in champagne, which has to have a heavier bottle because of the pressure. So anything that they can do to lighten the glass makes it less expensive to ship, is much better for the environment. And I always feel badly for all those people in the warehouses moving those cases around with those heavy glass bottles. So in fact, it really is a good idea, in fact, for them to do that. So very, very good. This is also, I just found out today, this is wine auction off in London from Bhutan. In other words, in Asia for the first time. The winery is an altitude of over 8,800 feet above sea level. Absolutely amazing. I'm thinking, wow. So, of course, that made me look. And in the Guinness Book of World Record, the highest vineyard in the world is in Tibet at over 11,000 feet. Just amazing to even think about growing grapes that high. Now, we do have a lot of wineries in Argentina that are, in fact, at the 5,000 and 6,000 feet level, which is pretty amazing in itself. But think about that. Growing grapes at 11,000 feet above sea level. Absolutely amazing. Just incredible. Thanks. So great. So, any questions, Emily? I'm talking too much.
Not specific to this wine. There are
Okay.
ones that I can hold to the end.
Okay. Well, then we'll go to the next wine. And the next wine is, as you can see, this is Dao. And I think that's how it's said. In fact, I kept trying to find out for sure if it is. But as you can see, this is Sauvignon Blanc. This is from Paso Robles. And again, so California. Very much the same color as we saw before. In fact, very, very light. Little bubbles. Oh, in fact, yeah, it has some spritz to it. Has a little thing. Of course, this is 2024. So realize, of course, these, this was grapes probably last September. Yeah, it does have has a little pétillance, little spritz to it. And if you swirl and smell this wine, very different. Softer pears. Wow. Pears coming out of there. Nice, almost spiced pears out of there. But again, you would expect that. Even though, certainly Chile is not a cool climate, you're going to be a little bit warmer, even though, in fact, this grape is from Paso, which is, in fact, a fairly warm climate in itself. And so having the warmer climate, you expect to be more fruit, a little more open, a little broader, etc. And this is truly what's coming out of this wine. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So pears and nice freshness. And of course, you taste this wine. That is a good quality Sauvignon Blanc from California. Just wonderful. Fresh fruit. It still has maybe a little peach there too. Has a little grip in the back too, which I really, really like about this wine. Now, I expect this wine it says see no oak at all. If it was anything, it'd be a little neutral, but I do wonder about that. Or actually, probably more than that, probably stays on the leaves for a while, meaning that in fact, after the vinification is done, after the yeast has died, instead of taking it off or racking it off into another container, what they're going to do is leave it there and stir it up. And this gives it that sort of rounder, creamier feel and gives a little bit more of that yeastiness that's in the finish in this wine, which in fact holds on very nicely with a little bit of sort of lemon curd there in the finish also. That's really nice and fresh. Pretty wine, very pretty wine. Oh, yeah. So a little bit about this wine. This, of course, shows you California, North Coast, and then Central Coast. So this is certainly in the Central Coast that you can see. And if I do a close, I thought I did a close up there. It's actually from Paso, which is the sort of lighter area right to the right below and to the right of the Central Coast words there, as you can see. It might be big enough on your screen to see there. And so that's in fact where Paso Robles is. That is there, making a lot of very, very good and some fairly expensive reds there also. But it's nice to see there. This is the winery. Was bought not very long ago, too, from what I understand. Beautiful vineyards, of course, as you can see. Also, in fact, you see it's relatively dry on the in and around there. Beautiful views, in fact, from the things. It's like a beautiful place, in fact, to go and visit, as wineries, in fact, are all the time. It is to see. There's a nice picture, in fact, from there, looking out at the winery that is there. Again, another great picture of the rolling hills that you often find in this area with all of the, looks like some lavender there, which we'll see again very soon. Beautiful pictures, again, many of these coming, in fact, from their website. Or actually, the other wonderful place, I'll tell you, when I look for pictures, is actually TripAdvisor, because people take such great pictures, and so you can very often, and so I steal them shamelessly in there. It's 100% Sauvignon Blanc. It's hand harvested. And they also say it's optically sorted. And of course, this is a 2024 vintage. Because it's fairly young, probably no one has, in fact, done any, I could find no scores on it. But the 2023 got 92 points. So I thought, in fact, that was certainly worth talking about. This is like one of the examples of one of the things that I find, and I know for most consumers, it's not that important, but it's like, okay, they hand harvest. Well, to optically sort, you have to have individual berries. So if they hand harvested, do they take them off the berries then? They also said, in fact, all of their wines were free run juice. But I'm like, well, you really don't get much free run juice off of whites because, when you have to press them to get any juice basically at all from them. So it's like, okay. And I tried to get more information from them, but with no luck at all. I sent them an email. I sent several places emails, in fact, saying, could you give me more information? And obviously, maybe, well, no one's out harvesting. I'm not sure what they were doing, but they certainly didn't answer me in all of this. But in fact, so I wish I had more information for you exactly about how this wine is made, but I don't, other than saying it's a very, very nice wine for that. I thought I would spend a moment, though, and talk, in fact, about the grape itself. And this is Sauvignon Blanc. There, of course, you can see a picture of, obviously, a white grape that is there. There's another picture of it with probably, in fact, a little riper. And so it has that wonderful sort of golden color to it. And I thought I would just give you a little bit of background about the grape because it's always so interesting. Sauvignon Blanc, it originated in the Loire. Very often you'll see people thinking it came from Bordeaux because, in fact, when you drink a white Bordeaux, typically, in fact, Sauvignon Blanc is the major grape that's in there, but Semillon is another one that's there, and there's a couple other minor ones. But Sauvignon Blanc is widely planted in the Loire. In fact, if you drink a Sancerre, in fact, we almost had one tonight, you would be drinking, in fact, a Sauvignon Blanc. It's really interesting. I just thought it was amazing. It was first mentioned, the grape was first mentioned in Rabelais' Gargantua. Of course, he wrote, of course, all those wonderful stories, etc., back, in the 1500s. In fact, this is when this verse was mentioned in there. And so it was interesting sort of reading that and finding that, of course, in translation, that's, in fact, the first time that Sauvignon Blanc, in fact, several other grapes were mentioned for this. It is the parent of Cabernet Sauvignon. In fact, it is, in fact, the half sibling of many, many different grapes. But probably in some ways, for many people, its claim to fame is that it's the parent. By the way, the other one is Cabernet Franc. And so you sort of put the two words together, in fact, to get this. It comes from the French word sauvage, which, of course, savage. And that's because the shape of its grape, the shape of its leaf is very much like the wild type of grape that, in fact, was around in France at this period of time. And so this was, in fact, a very close. And so it probably is, in fact, an ancient grape variety and very, very close to, in fact, the ancient grape that, in fact, was there. It is early to mid ripening. And so it's something, in fact, that you do pick fairly early. Very vigorous. And I've seen this time and time again. And especially because it's very vigorous, you almost have to beat it back. And so you want to use low vigor rootstocks on it and fairly lean soils. I remember, boy, a long time ago now, being in a winery and going, in fact, along with the owner. And in fact, he was saying he basically was having to lean out In other words, to get rid of the, by using grasses around, and mowing it down all the time and taking that away, to in fact pull up some of the nutrients, in fact, that was in the soil, because otherwise, it just grows out of control. It really is, in fact, an extremely vigorous grower. And so you really have to do what you can to sort of hold it back. Highly susceptible to botrytis, again, which can be good, if you want to make a sweet wine, but for most cases, botrytis is a disease. And so that's a real problem, in fact, with this. So you need to have good aeration, etc. And in fact, you may have to spray. Sometimes it's called Fumé Blanc. This was coined, I was surprised. I always thought it was Robert Mondavi, but as I was looking through, it was in fact first by David Stair, who runs, in fact, is still, I think is now emeritus at Dry Creek, but was taken up, in fact, by Robert Mondavi. He was the one who made that popular. So Mondavi made Fumé Blancs, in fact, still does. It's the third most planted grape in France, but as you will see in a moment, it is in fact the by far most widely planted grape in New Zealand. Over 80% of the white grapes, and most of the grapes in New Zealand are white, are in fact Sauvignon Blanc. So it's really very interesting. Also, it's interesting as you read, there is also a pink variety of Sauvignon called Sauvignon Gris, which of course is French for gray, and so it's this gray pinkish variety. And there is in fact some Sauvignon Rouge, but I didn't see any pictures of that. One thing I thought I would show you is there is this. This, in fact, you see this nice little book. You can take it, to read in bed. This is, of course, is called, as you can see, Wine Grapes. This is, in fact, done by Jancis Robinson and two other people. This is basically the Bible when it comes to wine grapes. And so it has basically, certainly at the time of its printing, every known grape variety and all things. It's got pictures of the various grapes that are very old, but in fact had pages and pages on Sauvignon Blanc. So I've actually sort of, consolidated it all for, in fact, you to see that. Just one more picture. That is, in fact, what a Sauvignon Blanc bunch of grapes looks like when it has been hit with botrytis. Actually, that's the good botrytis, that, in fact, they will actually pick those grapes. Can you believe that? And make wine out of it. But, of course, I didn't bring any of the ones. And then, of course, the picture next to it, surprisingly, and also is a picture that was taken in Chile, is, in fact, Sauvignon Gris. This is, in fact, the pink variety of Sauvignon Blanc, which, at least according to Jancis, is becoming more fashionable. And there's about 1,000 acres of it planted in all of France. A lot of it used in Bordeaux. So it's always interesting. I always learn so much when I do these kinds of things, because there's no way you can learn or know everything. Okay? Questions, Emily?
Again, more general questions. So I figured we could move on to the next wine, and I can just hold them till the end.
We might as well do it as a Sauvignon Blanc trifecta then, and go to Craggy Range. This is Craggy Range. As you can see, Sauvignon Blanc. It's from Martinborough, and we'll talk about that. The vineyard is called Temuna, and it's from New Zealand, 2023. I've not been to New Zealand yet. I've always wanted to go, but I have a little soft spot in my head or in my brain for Craggy Range because, in fact, you've heard me speak of him before. Evan Rose, who was one of my students, who is now the reserve winemaker at Stoller, did a harvest internship at Craggy Range. In fact, there's several of his friends in the wine industry in Oregon, in fact, at the same time. So he's a number of friends with this. So let's pull this out. Craggy Range. Again, that is one thing, again, I don't mind using a corkscrew, but a screw cap does certainly make life easy. Now, this one is certainly lighter than the other two. Yes, in fact, very light in color. As you can see there, of course. Oh, it also has little pétillance there. I don't know if you can see the bubbles on my screen, maybe there towards the top, but very, very tiny bubbles coming off of there. Again, just happens with a young wine, of which this is. But of course, this was picked 6 months earlier than the other ones that you saw. If you swirl and smell this wine, wonderful, just wonderful. There's a minerality, almost a gunpowder kind of aroma that's there. that's really, really nice. In fact, it reminds me, in fact, almost of a green tea also. And then fruit, sort of gooseberries and kiwi. Oh, yeah. And just, oh, it just has that wonderful, sort of minerality to it. Gee, that's nice. Don't even almost want to drink it. Ha, forget it. So, taste this wine. Mm-mm-mm-mm-mm. Ah, wonderful fruit, bright. Again, if you know what gooseberries taste like, kiwi, but has that wonderful, um, limes, and has that really, really nice minerality to it. Very, again, very sort of gunmetal kind of thing in there. Very sort of, just really, really wonderful sort of flavor that's there. Very flinty. Ah, that's a pretty wine. Yum. A little bit about this wine. Again, there it is, Craggy Range Sauvignon Blanc from Martinborough. This, of course, is New Zealand. New Zealand, of course, so interesting when it comes to wine because they also were basically settled for the most part by Presbyterians, and they were not wine drinkers. And in fact, they tried to, in the early 20th century, they tried, in fact, to completely ban alcohol. And it was only the returning doughboys in World War I who prevented that. But in fact, they had very, very strict laws. They did a complete 180 coming in the 70s and 80s, realizing, in fact, that there was certainly good money to be made, and that, in fact, that the wine industry, in fact, could be very, very good for New Zealand, which, in fact, it has been in there. And so, in fact, you can see Hawke's Bay up there. Hawke's Bay being one of the places that that was very, very, very important. One of the first important wineries, in fact, to be there. And you can see where Martinborough is there, right there at the tip of the North Island. Of course, as you go south, it gets cooler. Central Otago, which is down there furthest to the south, it makes, in fact, very good wines, but it's also known for, in fact, its Pinot Noirs that are there. So that, in fact, is where we are in the world. This, of course, is the entrance to Craggy Range. As you can see, really beautiful place there. And of course, up against the mountains there, hence the Craggy Range right behind it. And these beautiful vineyards, in fact, that are right there with everything sort of there. Another picture, in fact, of the pond that's there. They have, in fact, I don't know if you can make those out as being chickens there. They also have some, in fact, some metal cows that are also, in fact, on there that you often see in there. This, of course, is their beautiful cellar, showing, in fact, because they make reds also, as you can see there with there. Great old vines. In fact, that's a beautiful old vineyard that is, in fact, there. This is, in fact, from their from the vineyards, in fact, on their own website. Some other pictures, in fact, I think I still also stole from TripAdvisor in there. But look at that. Just beautiful and green. And so, again, you're really seeing from a different season the beautiful green, in fact, there at the Craggy Range that's there. It's very interesting. In fact, a couple of things are interesting. It's hand harvested, 8%. And of course, whole bunch, 8%. Well, that hand harvested is that 8% whole bunch. The rest of it, in fact, is probably, in fact, done by machine. That's at the destemmed is 92%. So I would say that was machine harvested. Stainless steel, and they use some French oak barrique in there. They use both the indigenous yeast, but they, in fact, inoculate also. But they only use 3% French barrels. This has very, very little. I don't really taste any oak. I think you get a little bit of the depth of flavor, in fact, from some of the older oak that they may use. They only mature for 3 months. They fine it. They filter it also, which I thought was interesting, 12.5% alcohol. 2.5 grams, that's well below what you would be able to, in fact, tell that there's any sugar in there at all. So it basically is a dry wine. pH relatively low, 3.23. As you expect, this wine has good acidity there. And so, in fact, this is very, very important in all of that. And what do other people think? Again, look at this. One of the reasons I wanted to use this, 94 points. It was number 11 in the top 100 wines in the Wine Spectator of last year. Fresh and precise, lime, mango, passion fruit, mild, crunchy sea salt, I don't know what they mean by light seal, dry chamomile and fresh lemon zest, mouth-watering, fleshy frame, vibrant lime, tropical fruit, jalapeno. I don't get much jalapeno. Herbal nuances, I understand with that. Citric crunch, etc. Flower with aniseed and licorice. Isn't it interesting how you see all these differences? Some subtle lemons, medium to light body, dry, lovely fruit notes, subtle and fine finish. Well done for the vineyard. Drink now. And I certainly think, in fact, it is really quite lovely. But and I think it deserves the 94 points. I think it's just a beautiful, beautiful wine to, in fact, enjoy. Oh, yes. So very nice. So very, very nice. Okay. So how are we doing there, Emily?
Yeah, so we actually do have a question about this wine
Sure.
specifically. Let me get your slides off here. There we go. So somebody said that they have the 24 vintage and that it was really strong grapefruit when they opened it, and now that has gone away. What would be that reason for maybe that's
Well,
that
it's very interesting,
super
and
strong?
that, it really ends up. In fact, and I did not get to read it today. Robin Garr, that's Garr, has been doing a wine blog. He writes a weekly thing forever. At least 30 years or more. It is very good. But one of the things that he was talking about is wine tasting an art or a science. And I think, in fact, there's certainly a bit of both. I think it's the same way with winemaking. And what you have with wine is, obviously there are hundreds of chemicals within that glass of wine. And because of that, when it begins to interact with the air, it's going to cause changes. And it will change all the time. And so that first thing that you may get out of there is, in fact, what was very volatile in that bottle itself right off the bat. And so that's what you notice. But as the air interacts with the wine and vice versa, what happens is you start getting other flavors and aromas that end up coming out of it. And in fact, Pinot Noir is wonderful for that. You will smell it, and 5 minutes later, you will smell something else, etc. This is why it's one of the things, but I can't do anything about in class. One of the things, in fact, that I do is I don't decant in class because typically when you first taste a wine, or if you go to things, you don't have a chance, in fact, to do that. And so I wish that that the wine would stay longer in the glass in class, but trust me, it doesn't. So that they can really sort of see how things develop, even in the time that I'm talking, and then go back to the wines. I see how they changed, and that's what's nice. Which is, by the way, I use typically a larger glass as a white wine glass. I never fill it more than a third. But it's nice just to sip it and give it some time to really open up. By the way, there was a very long article that I also read this week about red wines and about, again, and all of it was like, oh yeah, that's exactly what I do. Not too warm, probably 60, between 60 and 65, letting it open, talking about, in fact, a young wine, letting it, in fact, decant. But for the most part, I don't decant. It's just really the younger wines, or having a big enough glass so that it will open up, in fact, in the glass. Because if you just open the bottle, nothing's going to happen. A lot of times when I would go to wine tastings, where, in fact, would be a young red, they would double decant. Meaning, in fact, they would take the wine, they would pour it out of the bottle into another container, and then immediately pour it back in the bottle, because again, you were mixing the wine with so much air by double decanting, so that in fact it would give the wine a little bit of a chance to open up, so you can really sort of tell. Because when a wine's young, it takes a while for those things to happen. By the way, I will warn you, the opposite is with older wines. You really do not want to let them sit very well. I've had several examples where you'll drink something and the first taste, it will be wonderful, and a half hour, 45 minutes later, the wine, all the flavors and aromas are gone. So in fact, young wines need very often air. Older wines typically do not. They will develop in the glass depending on how old they are, but that's in fact a good thing to think about. So that's probably why that grapefruit was there so strongly, and then hightailed it out of there, in there. And it's really wonderful to see all the nuances that you can get out of wine. I'm sometimes just shocked at some of the aromas you'll get. I remember a long time ago being at a wine tasting, and again in this huge place, and it was a red wine, and it smelled of hyacinths. There was no question. And of course, I thought it was a little crazy. And then until somebody across the room basically said hyacinths, I thought, well, good. At least I know there's two of us that are crazy. And so that was very, very nice. Okay.
Yep. Since we're talking about grapefruit, I thought I would just share with you that I am drinking my most favorite and your favorite drink, the grapefruit White Claw.
Uh-huh.
One year, Jack got me a grapefruit or a White Claw Christmas ornament for Christmas, and it
I know
hangs
my
on my
audience.
tree.
What can I say? Come on.
That is the only question that's specific to this wine. So, like I
Mm,
said, I'll hold the
that
others
is
till the
a
end.
beautiful wine. That really is just lovely. I mean, the other ones, I'm certainly not denigrating the other two, but wow, that just has so much going on. It just goes on and on. That's really just a beautiful glass. Yum. And well, actually, I'll leave it because I brought down two white wine glasses. Wasn't that clever of me? Okay, so our next wine is, in fact, we're going to go on to rosé. And what better way to celebrate the summer than to celebrate it with a glass of rosé? And so I thought this one, in fact, would be very interesting, in fact, to do. One thing, look at the color. I mean, it really is. And for this is so very, very typical of Provence. And in fact, again, those of you have been drinking wine for fairly, it's always interesting to see how the color of wine, well, I should say, especially rosés, have changed. You know, in so many cases, rosés were much darker in color. And of course, many of us drank, like there were white Zinfandels and things like that, which in fact, were very much pinker typically, and by the way, they've always drunk a tremendous amount more rosé in France than practically anywhere else in the world. It really has always been extremely important. In fact, if you walk into a supermarket, like a wine supermarket that has a lot of wines in France, you will often find an entire, aisle that is devoted, in fact, to rosés. And so they drink a lot of rosé, and especially in the summertime in France, especially in the south of France, where, in fact, this wine comes from. But this very much almost skin tone is very much typical of the South. Now, again, I'm starting to see, again, people are experimenting more and giving, sort of different colors, in fact, to the rosés, which I think is a good idea. It doesn't always have to be this color. Again, I take off the cap. And literally, I mean, it is so light. It is almost not darker than the wines we just had. I mean, that's sort of just amazing, in fact, to see with that. Back in there. Then look at that. I mean, really, at least thing. You can almost not tell. I'm sure you can tell at home, and I can tell by putting it down there. That is a very pale pink, but it is an extremely pale pink. Again, I hope no. I don't think I chilled it too much. I tried not to. In fact, I just wanted to put just a little bit of a chill. Again, whites, 50, 55. You don't want it to be too cold. We say the wine's dumb. And you and I have had that happen so often, where if the wine is too cold, luckily, of course, in the glass, or sometimes, where I'll go to places, and, there's been a number of places I've been. Where was I just? I was just having dinner or was someplace. And of course, I spent, a few minutes, in fact, sort of warming up my glass just a little bit because you can just smell it better. And so that really makes a difference. This is slightly chilled, but I don't think too bad there. But if you swirl and smell this wine, so different right away. It's brighter. It's got those red fruits, probably strawberries more than anything else. Maybe some raspberry, no strawberries. It really gets that sort of strawberry aroma, especially that, how strawberries can sometimes have that floral aroma to them. This has very much that sort of floral aroma to it. Oh, yes, just lovely. And again, just taste this wine. I didn't even notice. I hope no one noticed I had the music going on in the background. I didn't notice myself. Mm, 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 mm. Very different. And it's because of that, you know, um, I'm trying to even think, for some reason, of course, yeah. Yeah, I'm a little crazy. I know that. It reminds me of hay. It's that grassiness or something like that in the finish that you get. In fact, it's almost a bready sort of hay-like flavor that's there. But again, but on top of that is the sort of strawberries and nice freshness to that. beautiful acidity, but not too sharp. Mm, just a beautiful summertime wine. And I think right away of all of the foods that would go with this, any number of type of appetizers. You could certainly do this with shrimp. You could certainly do this with chicken. You could certainly do this with just so many things. I think because of the acid, etc., it would be good with a lot of Asian dishes. I think it would be really nice with sushi. I can see a lot of things, right away with food because of that nice finish to it, that gives it enough backbone so that it really in fact works very, very, very well. Obviously by itself, but as a food wine, I think that would be wonderful. I think you could also do it with ham. As a picnic wine, it's unparalleled. That really is just really a beautiful, beautiful wine. A little bit about this wine. Oh, yeah, and it's almost a little lead pencil or something in that nose. Also, that's what it reminds me of. I know, I'm crazy. By the way, I'm so glad I didn't forget. Notice at the bottom of the label, and it says Appellation d'origine Protégée. This is protected. In other words, it's appellation, the name in other words, where the wine came from is protected. And of course, it's coteau. Coteau is just basically plural for cote, which is hills around Aix-en-Provence. It is, but typically you will find, and I just thought of a reason too. Typically you will find in France that they use appellation d'origine contrôlée. In other words, meaning that in fact because that was the French term that was used. This one, the AOP, is actually an EU designation, and you will find some wines in France that will use that, but far, far fewer. So I thought that was interesting. In fact, that they're actually using the European Union naming of Protégée instead of contrôlée in there, and I wanted to point that out. Again, you can see, in fact, this is from Provence. If you can see, in fact, of course, there's sort of, they decided to make everything in purple. But I guess you could say maybe the reddish purple, sort of burgundy, is, in fact, you can see Coteau d'Aix-en-Provence over to the far left of that, and not to Le Beau, but very close to it, in fact, as you can see. So this is very much the south of France, in fact, because that's obviously the Mediterranean there. You can see, of course, on the map, the small French map there to your right that is there. This is, in fact, one of their own ads for Axe that is there. So it's very, very neat. Beautiful vineyards, of course, up there, on the hills there. In fact, actually fairly high. Coteau, of course, is hills. And so this winery is fairly high in these hills in Provence. Again, there's another beautiful picture with, in fact, sort of a sunset of that. And of course, nicely done. Of course, not surprising. Provence, you have to have the lavender, in fact, very close by that's there. Again, this sort of very white soil, etc. So these, in fact, are pictures, in fact, from there. Look at that, of course, obviously very close. It's wonderful. You have I like the juxtaposition of the rose, of that beautiful lavender, which must smell just heavenly. And then, of course, the vineyards. And, of course, the lavender in the back also. That's interesting. Of course, they probably picked at very different times because, in fact, the volatile chemicals in lavender, in fact, wine will pick that up. There's no question. And so, but I really don't think that this has. But in fact, that's an interesting thing to think about in there. This is very interesting, too. This is the owner. His name, as you can see, is Eric Kurzer. He's a Dutchman. He actually bought it late. This, in fact, originally, this farm started as a truffle farm. So, in fact, they grew trees, in fact, to grow truffles. This, in fact, was in, I think, the early, sort of the turn of the late 1800s. It was then, in fact, one of the largest, because, in fact, it is quite large. It had a completely different name, and then he renamed it only. And I found it and then I've forgotten again. I think it was not until like 2008 where he bought this property, and in fact has done a tremendous amount of work in the property. Probably, though, in fact, being Dutch is why he was less apt to use the French term of contrôlé, and then protégé is my thought, in fact, of all of that. This is a blend of grapes. It's 60% Grenache, which of course is so typical of the south of France. 20% Syrah, and then 20% Cinsault. And Cinsault is one of those grapes that, in fact, is sometimes sort of looked down upon. We'll talk about that in a bit also. But again, beautiful, beautiful wine. Appellation de Provence, actually, the Coteau d'Aix-de-Provence, there in the hills. And 12.5% alcohol, so no, certainly not bad along that line at all. In there, I like this. In fact, this is what they say. This wine showcases enticing aromas, ripe stone fruit, summer berries. Again, that's on the palate, vibrant raspberry, ripe cherry, warm, sun-kissed flavors. Best enjoyed between 25 and 28. Quintessential example of Provençal style. VinePair give it 92 points. In there, it offers both juicy, acid, grapefruit juice. Maybe I could see that maybe coming out now, but I think with that, as well as a bitter grapefruit pith and chalky minerality. Yeah, I guess I do see that. Yeah, when it first came out, though, I was thinking much more strawberries. But now, yes, I think grapefruit certainly is coming out in that. So very nice wine. Very nice wine. Any questions, Emily? While I drift off to the south of France.
I'll start asking some of these questions because otherwise we're going to be very heavy with the questions at the end. So somebody just asked, what is considered young wine? You mentioned decanting. Let me check. Sorry, this was sent to an email.
Young wine.
You mentioned let young wine decanter, but not an older wine. Is that just based on the vintage?
Yes, and actually, and obviously depending on the grape. A very good question, because as I think of all the time, certainly well over 90% of all wines produced should be drunk between 1 to 3 years of bottling. You want those fresh fruit flavors. You want that wonderful things, especially. I hate to say this about whites because there are whites that are just amazingly ageable, but for the most part, it's probably true of more whites than reds. And that's, of course, because with reds, you've got the tannin, probably most of all, which needs to soften up. And so could use some age. So when I'm talking about decanting, I'm almost always thinking about reds, and I'm probably thinking wines that are probably less than 3 or 4 years old as being young. Though there are a number of reds, again, obviously depends on the quality, the concentration, grape variety. Obviously, things like Cabernets, which have a lot of tannins to them, are more apt to need decanting for a longer period of time. In other words, as they, for several more years than say even a Pinot Noir. Etc. Where, again, Nebbiolo, when I think of Barolos, etc., they probably, in fact, they probably certainly need decanted for maybe their first 4 or 5 years for that. After that, and again, there's no hard and fast rules. These are just sort of general terms. After that, then, so that's why we consider it to be a young wine. Most people, in fact, think that even Bordeaux should be drunk. Some people think, in fact, the magic number, even in a good vintage, is like 10. And so like 5 to 10 years old, because you have to realize winemakers are dumb and they know what their audience wants. And as I say in class, 90% of wine that is purchased is drunk certainly within 24 hours of purchase, and certainly within a week. And so people don't hold wines. And so winemakers know this, and so they have ways of making wine that are more accessible, meaning easier to drink when the wine is young. And that has happened a lot more. And Bordeaux is a perfect example, especially after 82. This is what they've done. And so typically you don't have to wait, as in fact you would very often previously, maybe 15 or 20 years. Typically 6 to 10 years for almost, except for maybe the very, very top Bordeaux, those wines are probably still wonderfully drinkable. Do you have to decant them? Maybe in some cases, sure. Or maybe at least open them and put them in a decanter for a while, or certainly put them in a nice glass and let them breathe as you're tasting them. I would say that's true. But for the most part, that's pretty much what I think when I'm thinking. And trust me, I'm not a big one for I don't do a lot of decanting, and I don't own an aerator. I don't think that they're necessary. To tell you the truth. Anything else?
Yeah, let's do one more while we're here. You talked about the grapes and considering what's considered a young wine. So what would you consider the most important factor for growing high quality grapes?
Place. No question. It really ends up being where are the grapes grown that end up being so important. And this is why we talk. And in fact, it was sort of funny, again, I've been around long enough to know that a good while ago, a lot of people in California sort of poo-pooed the idea of terroir, which of course is French for the whole thing about where a wine grows. But there's no question, time and time again, um, grapes grown in certain areas have a wonderful fragrance, have a wonderful flavor, and so they make them so very special. Um, at the same time, and this of course is truly the worry in there's no question in the grape world, is that grapes, because they are so sensitive to climatic change, because we're having climatic change, the grapes show that. You know, grapes are getting riper earlier in the season. In fact, quite a bit earlier in the season. And we do worry about. By the way, in fact, if I've not said this, I think recently Outer Yarrow, I think now, I wish I remember, I think he said 2021 was talking about what a great year, of course, that was. In fact, he thought the best in decades in California. And I will tell you flat out, probably 2023 will also, especially obviously I'm talking about when it comes to really good red wines, or probably just wines in general. 2023 in California was a fantastic year. Why? Because it was a cooler year. And because of that, the grapes ripened more slowly. They could get a lot more flavors along with the sugar, etc. And so from everything I've read, 2023 will be a year to drink and collect for that. So I think most importantly, along with, obviously grape variety, where are the grapes grown? And so it shows up. It shows up in the wine. There's no question about it. Okay.
Yep, that's all for now.
Okay. Well, then we're off. Do. Yep. There we are. Lyric. I'll switch over to a red glass. By the way, and I'm certainly not very doctrinaire. In fact, it was interesting. I read this fairly long article just a couple days ago about red wines, etc. And it's like what the guy was talking about. Again, I want a glass that is, good size. I want it to come together because it sort of holds the aromas a little bit closer together. And so I don't want it to be certainly open at the top. And so, the thing, but it's like, no, I don't, there's these, I think they're called altos. There's some glasses that have become sort of the darling of wineries, but they're, I think, I don't know, $60 a piece. I will stick with my restaurant Riedels for the most part because so this next wine is Lyric. Whoops, helps if I open it, doesn't it? There you go. This is made by Etude. And again, look at that color. Beautiful. By the way, very typical, and I'm very happy to see. You can see through it. To me, that is almost a necessity when it comes to Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir, it should not be a very dark wine. I find if I can't see through a Pinot Noir, I'm immediately saying that while some people may love it, I probably am not going to. I find it over extracted. I think Pinot Noir should be elegant. Of course, I think elegance in wine or most anything is a good thing. But I think, in fact, that they should, in fact, be very elegant. And so that's very, very nice with that. So again, if you swirl this wine, very young, obviously you can see some purple highlights to this wine. And smell it. Yep, that's Pinot. No question about that. Wonderful. Sort of black cherries. Actually, there's a little plums in it too. Oh yeah, and there's a nice sort of spiciness to that wine. Almost a hint of cinnamon. So it's so always interesting to see. Oh, it's just pretty. It just is. And of course you taste this wine. Really, for the price, It can't be beat. It's got wonderful, again, that cinnamon, that spiciness that's there, wonderful fruit, soft and round and inviting, just just so pretty. Just really very, very easy to drink. Not horrendous, and actually it's a lot of different flavors. So while it's not, in fact, the most complex Pinot Noir you'll have, it's certainly wonderful. And again, I think a very good food wine. Right away, of course, my automatic thing is salmon, but I think certainly a lot of other foods that, in fact, would go very, very, very nicely with this wine. It's a kind of wine, too, where it's like, you could do that with chicken, no problem at all. There's a lot of things, in fact, that you could do with this wine when it comes to food, etc. A bit about this wine, and again, I do apologize. I spent way too much time, and I read to them also. Oh, by the way, for those of you who have the bottle, and it may not be the easiest thing to see. In fact, as you can see, even on my picture, it doesn't show this way. So I thought I would share this with you. There's a pleasure in the pathless woods. There's a rapture on the lonely shore. There is society where none intrudes, by the deep sea and music in its roar. I love not man the less, but nature more. Wonderful. Just, in fact, I can relate. This, in fact, is the opening of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, which, in fact, I've never read, even though I'm very familiar with the poem, because Lord Byron, of course, was the darling of Regency England, and so very, very important in all of that. And so, in fact, led a very, very romantic life and all the things going on. I think he actually drowned in Italy, from what I remember, in there. But in fact, yes. But I thought that was really wonderful that they, in fact, used that, obviously as the lyric, in fact, for this. So I thought I would share that with you, since that's on the front label on that wine. These again shows you all the main growing regions of California. If I go into the Central Coast, you can see, of course, the Monterey AVA, which is where this is from. Monterey being fairly cool, because you've got the Monterey Bay, and then with that you've got the influx of the again of the cold marine air, and so this allows you to grow things like Chardonnay and Riesling and other cool climate grapes, of which Pinot Noir is definitely a cool climate grape, and so does very, very well in this. And so I'm really glad, in fact, to see that in fact it was from Monterey in all of that. Again, I like that this is one of the few pictures, in fact, that they had there, showing you, of course, the fog, which in fact you would see in the morning, because in fact you had that marine layer coming in with the fog on these vines like this. And the other picture they had, in fact, was in fact right at the sea, and these are fairly coastal, but do you see a grapevine in there? Maybe there. I don't think there's a grapes back there. So in fact, but I thought that was an interesting picture, in fact, that they had of that that's there. Oops, I apologize. This is 100% Pinot Noir. It's done in 25% French oak. But unfortunately, when I look at, I look for tech sheets. And so when I tried to find the tech sheet, it's like, okay, if it was 25% French oak, how much of it's new? I doubt very, very much of it would be new at all. But how many months did it spend in French oak? So these are the kind of geeky things that I like to share with you that doesn't stop you from enjoying this wine at all. But I would have liked to have known, because it's the kind of information that I like to share, in fact, with you. But my thought is that it probably, in fact, was certainly no new oak, and probably did not spend more than maybe 3 to 6 months in an oak barrel, in fact, and not new, because what it does is it gives the wine a roundness, it gives it a characteristic, but there's really not much oak flavor or any characteristic, in fact, that's in that wine, which is perfectly fine. In fact, it really is quite nice, for that reason. In fact, really quite a lovely wine for that. But that's unfortunately the only things that I can tell you about how the wine was made. I will tell you, though, it got 90% from the enthusiasts, and I could not agree more. Instead of saying cinnamon, they say clove. Fat, black cherry aromas are spiced by cola and clove on the nose for this bottling. The palate is framed by dusty tannins, with more cherry cola components taking central stage. I have no problem with that at all. Very, very, very true as to what is going on in that wine. So very nice. Very nice. Mm-hmm. Questions, Emily? Anything at all? Or shall we continue?
We can continue.
Okay. This is Again, you're probably thinking, huh? The language of yes? What? Seriously? What is going on? What is all this? And then, of course, you look at the name of the wine. Cuvée, again, very French. Cinsault, okay? What does that mean? You have to realize, in fact, as you will see in a moment, who we're dealing with. And that, of course, is Randall Graham. So again, if I take this wine, I like the label. It looks like, in fact, people working, but of course it's in gold at the same time. I imagine many of you, in fact, have this bottle, and so you did see that that is there, as you can see on the label. In fact, I caught the gold very nicely in the picture that I took to show you that. The color, again, not very dark, and that's to be expected. And we'll talk about the whys of that in a moment. There. Again, yes, not very dark. A little darker, obviously, the other one. You can still see through it without any difficulty, though the color is a bit different, a little more plummy, etc. And wow, the aroma is just leaps out of the glass. I didn't even get it close to my nose before I'm already smelling all those wonderful fruit aromas. And again, if you swirl, wow, and smell this wine, isn't that nice? I mean, it's got that herbal aroma that you expect, you think of, in fact, from the south of France. Oh yeah, just sage and rosemary and thyme, etc., all blended together. There's fruit that's there, but it's really the herbal quality of that wine, which is just amazing. But very nicely sort of put together. And right away, I think, oh, if you do things on the grill, and especially if you do things, of course, that you've used herbs, in the marinade or something like that, how wonderful this would be. And that certainly could be chicken, it could be pork, it could even certainly be beef. Oh, now it's always interesting. See, it's opening up. There's almost a floral aroma coming out of that wine. So pretty. Very, 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 very nice. Yeah. Yeah, and a little, almost not quite mint, but all those herbs. And of course, you taste this wine. Mm-mm-mm. Summertime in a glass. I mean, literally. I mean, tannins certainly are there. Nice and soft and round. Wonderful fruit. Real bright fruit. Plums, I would say. Blackberries, certainly also there. Those spices and herbs that are there. Oh yeah. I don't have time. It makes me want to go up and make a paella. It really just reminds me, just something that, again, I think even would be really wonderful with paella, with that, smoked paprika and all of that would be in there would just be wonderful with that. So really very, very nice. Very nice. A little bit about this wine. Again, this is Randall Graham. Actually, nice little leaf fig behind him. Randall Graham, there are a lot of wacko people in the wine business. Randall is probably right up there. You can, in fact, if you ever want to look through about some of the things that he's done in the past, etc. He started Bonnie Doon. He started Bonnie Doon a number of years ago, and he also was one of the original Rhone Rangers. Again, you can see obviously a play on the Lone Rangers. He felt very, very strongly that California, and not surprisingly, would be the best place or a wonderful place to grow grapes that thrive in the south of France. Again, when we think of California, and when we talk about, what do we think about right away? Napa Sonoma. Well, because of the marine influence in those areas, they're cooler climates. But if you think about the rest of California, it's certainly not as close to the ocean. They are warmer, and they are, in fact, Mediterranean climates. And so this is something that he felt very, very strongly about, which is why, in fact, he was one of the Rhone Rangers. One of my favorite wines that he made that I always laugh, again, I always tell the class, you may remember, especially in the 60s, 50s and 60s, everyone was so worried about UFOs, etc. I think, if the UFOs came, I think the aliens thought, really, we're not dealing with these people, and so they left, so we don't have a problem. So what happened was uh, the the town of Châteauneuf-du-Pape, which of course very famous in the south of France, they passed a law basically outlawing flying saucers in their space. Well, of course, in France, you don't have flying saucers, you have flying cigars, le cigar volant. So what he did was he made a wine called that as basically an homage, his homage to Chateauneuf, using in fact many of the same grapes, in fact, but showing in fact this, flying saucer, flying cigar, up in the thing with a tractor beam on these poor unsuspecting people. This is to give you an idea about what a wacko person, in many ways, he is. And so it was. He of course sold. I think did very well. Sold Bonnie Doon because it got to be very big, and I think it was too much for him. He now, in fact, works in the language of yes, and in fact, this is owned. It's in a partnership of all people in many cases, what you would think, with Gallo. Again, the largest winery in the world, but I think for the most part they've given him free reign and they've allowed him to, in fact, pick and choose from various vineyards, in fact, that they own, that in fact so that he could make the wines like the wine that you see right there. This, of course, is the vineyard, absolutely lovely here in basically sort of Central Coast, California. There, another picture. You can see how dry it is, of course, in the summer. But I would think, oh no, actually, I do see some drip irrigation there. So these, in fact, are dripped. But it's interesting. The Language of Yes started in 2020 as a collaboration between Randall Graham and Maze Rose, as you can see. In fact, using Gallo's top vineyards in the Central Coast. The thing is, and I felt sort of dumb, to tell you the truth, that I didn't get the connection. The Language of Yes is in fact a direct translation from Languedoc. Languedoc is the major wine region of southern France, and that's because the word is the same as language, langue, but in the south of France they spoke Occitan, where when they would say yes, they would say oc. So it's Languedoc, where in the north they would say oui, which in fact, when we know French, of course, you know that yes is oui in French, but in the south it was oc. And so the Language of Yes, in fact, is his, in fact, translation. So in fact, still being true to what he wants to do, in fact, in the south of France. And so that's where, in fact, this came from, which I thought was very, very neat. And so I actually took his writings and said, in winemaking as in life, timing is everything. They selected the Cinsault, by the way, is in fact, this is Cuvée Cinsault because in fact, that is in fact, the name of the grape is Cinsault, and that's how it's said in French. And the Syrah vineyards, mostly in Baja, Monterey County, lower, from the Cuvée with the intention of achieving more of a ripening of the two. So the Cinsauts harvest first, they destem and crush in the tank, but they let it sit overnight. So it puts out a little bit of juice. But what they do then, in fact, is they draw off some of it because Cinsault is a big grape and doesn't have a lot of character, a lot of color to the wine. So they draw off some of the juice. That's what they mean by saignée, meaning bleeding. So what they do then, and it goes, in fact, into their pink wine, which they call les fruits rouges, and then the red fruits. And then, of course, what they do is on top of it, they put the Syrah grapes. And so they co-ferment. So the Syrah and the Cinsault actually ferment together. So I wanted you to understand what winemakers do sometimes to make the wine that they want. Large neutral vessels to remain natural. In other words, they use stainless steel or something along those lines, becoming fruit and spice, modern 10, and alcoholic degree. And then, of course, as he says, our red Cuvée Cinsault and the pink is twin or complementary. As he says, Cinsault often produces a rather ginormous cluster, his words, typically low in tannins, not particularly rich in anthocyanins, the pigmented material found in the grape skins. They in fact they bring the crop levels down so they'll get more of those from the vines, and then remove the wings. In fact, or what the Italians would call archetti, the larger varieties, rigorous thinning of this. And then to make a more concentrated and vivid red wine, they bleed part of it away, and then they add Syrah, which of course has lots of color to it, to in fact sort of stabilize and protect it with this. So in fact, this is what he wants to do with it. It says best served slightly cold, etc. So that's in fact how this wine is made. And of course, what was it thought of? And I could not agree more. Fresh and zippy with black raspberry, scarlet rose are enhanced by wet earth, sumac, and cinnamon. On rose is 64% Cinsault-based blend, which also includes 26% Syrah, 6% Grenache, 3% Tannat, which in fact is a grape that has a lot of tannins to it, and 1% Viognier, which is a white grape that provides a little bit of the bright, fresh aromas to this wine. As he says, thyme and fennel pollen fronds lead to the herbaceous palate before bright raspberry, lemon peel, and warm toast elements arise. So it really is a really, really lovely wine and a beautiful summertime red. Questions, Emily? Getting to the end of the road here.
Yeah, and I'll just ask all the general questions now before you close it out, if you're
Sure,
okay with that. Okay. Okay, so the first one is, can you spend a little bit of time talking about how yeast is a tool that can help reveal or modify the flavors already present in the grapes, adding its own distinct flavors?
Sure. Wonderful question. And really, again, you could spend hours. You could probably, in fact, get your PhD in it. It's very interesting, and there's so much we don't know about microbiological ecosystems. And in fact, a lot of wineries, in fact, they feel that they want to only use the yeast that is found within the vineyard, in other words, on top of the grapes, to make their wine. So they will use what they call indigenous yeast. But there are also, to go to the exact opposite end of the spectrum, designer yeast. So you can buy yeast that will increase the amount of fruit. You can use it, which will reduce the amount of bubbling that happens. All kinds of things like this. In fact, one of the things I show in class is a spider diagram where if you use two different yeasts, the resultant wine, even though the grapes are exactly the same, will be different. And so yeast is, in fact, a powerful tool within the winemaker. Now, it's interesting, and I'm not sure, again, these are sort of questions that I have going around in my brain. I think that, the winemakers or the people who make wine that they're sort of passionate about and sort of family, or it's been in the family, they tend to only use indigenous yeast, or they tend to use these kinds of things because they have a certain idea in their head about what they want to do. But again, there's no problem with somebody who, in fact, is, has the background, has the learning to think, oh, if I use this yeast, that will give me a different flavor profile from this grape or this wine. And so that's perfectly fine. But it's just two different ways of looking at the same thing that's important. So yes, some people will only use the yeast that comes out of the vineyard, but some people, in fact, and probably to great, very well for them. And again, depending on what you want to do too, because in fact, sparkling wine yeasts are different than regular wine yeasts. And we still don't know, because of course there are many, we use the term yeast, which is a very broad term. And of course, when we talk about wine yeast, we think about Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which in fact is the one that's typically that ends up. But we're understanding more and more that early in the fermentation process, when they can stand it, when there's not much alcohol, there are many, many yeasts that play a role in giving certain flavors to wines. And we still don't understand all of that. It's just one of the things that makes winemaking so interesting, that in fact, the yeast that come off or on the skins will play a role in the flavor of that wine, which is in fact was why we talk about that again, that microbiological ecology. So yeast does, it plays a huge role in all of this. And on one hand, it can be extremely, I hate just to use the word natural because it's all natural, but one can be completely, where we're not going to, interfere at all, to, oh yeah, we're going to take control of this and this is what we're going to do. So I hope that maybe a bit long, but that answered that question.
No, that's perfect. And you kind of touched on this a little bit in the beginning. but somebody had a little bit more. Actually, they asked this question before you even brought it up. But with the tariffs, what will they be doing to the wine industry, both domestic and foreign? How might it impact access, price in the industry generally, do you think? Or what, I guess more than just your opinion, what you've heard from your partners in
Yeah,
the
in looking
industry.
at everything, and in fact, trust me, and again, and the markets in fact reflected this. There was a shudder that went through the wine industry with today's announcement that there may be a 50% tariff on goods coming from the EU. As you saw, in fact, in basically my first slide, or one of my first slides, that most of our wine imports this past quarter came from France. Second was Italy, and of course, not far behind there, Germany, etc. And so, adding to that, of course, is going to add to prices, is going to add to a burden on, in fact, the American people who are bringing this wine in. And so, yeah, it's a worry that is in fact felt around the world. And so, yeah, the tariffs again. Let's face it, tariffs are taxes, and so you're going to be paying more for all of these things if they are in fact enacted. Simple as that.
Thank you. And now, since we are getting close to our time, I have one more question, and this kind of encompasses several people's questions about what are your favorite summertime wines if you were just kicking back on your back porch, which those of you who have watched before, you have a beautiful porch view, plants, everything. So if you're sitting back there, what are you drinking in the summer and what are you snacking on?
What am I drinking? Probably what I have at home. I will say, obviously, in fact, and I think if you've attended these, I have certain wines. I mean, I really like sparkling wines. There's in fact a sparkling wine called Aimory, Aimery, which I very often find on a flash site. That in fact I like those because they're nice and refreshing, etc. But I really like Pinot Gris. I like Pinot Blancs. And again, you tend to go more white in the summertime just because it is, refreshing, etc. Um, I said I'm hard to pin down because I'm very much the love the one you're with kind of person. It's like, oh yeah, this is delicious. Oh wait, but that's delicious. Um, and so typically sort of a lot of sort of maybe a little more fruit forward wines, but white burgundies, Macon Village. Yeah, it's like I don't I don't know. Again, I do a lot of entertaining and have people over, and so I'm always pulling out various bottles. People who know me, of course, know that I make the smoked salmon dip all the time, which I have no matter what time of year it is, etc. And I don't know. I tend to, and I think this is probably actually, I will throw it the other way. I think it's so important to keep your eyes and your mind open as to just all the incredible wines that are out there. And it's like, I hope I'm not offending anyone, but I think the worst thing is like to someone who only drinks Chardonnay or only things, it's like, oh, there's so much. It's, can I use this word? Diversity. There's so much diversity in the world when it comes to wine. And for me, I'm always like, oh, I've never tasted that great before. And very often it's like, well, I mean, it was great. In fact, as you might remember, when we did a wine tasting up in Chicago, I used a wine that was called Chopatino. I never had a Chopatino before in my life. And it was really, really lovely. And again, I found out in the 60s, there were only 100 vines of that wine ever that were left in existence. But somebody took advantage of it. They planted a lot of vineyards. And so now you can buy it. You could have it in Chicago. And those kinds of light reds are great in the summertime. So for me, it's like, no, let's keep my options open. Let's try something new. Let's try, in fact, I just recently what was it I never had before? I think it was a white Tempranillo. So, oh, I've never had a white Tempranillo. I've got to try that, etc. I try not to break the bank when I think. So I really wish I could give you an answer, but I really, trying things out and being open and being, adventurous, I think is just so much fun, and then you don't get stuck in any kind of rut or anything like that, because wine's fun. Wine's to be, fun to have and fun to enjoy and fun to share. That certainly is pretty much, I guess, how I've lived my life. Sort of funny to think about.
Perfect. And that is all the time we have for questions.
Oh,
Although
great.
one person did say that we should do a Kirkland Costco wine tasting, and I think that would be a lot of fun.
Hey, I have no problem with that. I've looked through Kirtland's wines, in fact, and they have some very, very good,
Yeah.
some very, very good bargains. I'm
And
open to suggestions. Trust
well,
me.
people often have times finding, not everyone, but some people have a hard time finding all the wines. So I feel like Costco is pretty widely,
Uniform, yeah, that's
yeah, out there. So that could
and let
be
me
really
first, in fact,
fun.
let me first say, when I do these things, I try very, very hard to find wines that, in fact, that I think are fairly widely available, certainly at least in Ohio, and 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 I, and I'd be the first person to tell you sometimes I feel badly when you cannot find the wines. When I expect that that's why, in fact, I try to do them that are very widely. Again, something else I thought about you doing again is I know that Fran Kaisela, a Miami alum, um, I've done one of his things before, but he also not only has a distribution in Ohio, but a number of other states, and has also a website so you can get his wines. And so I was thinking about maybe the next time using Fran's wines again for that reason, because obviously it is fun and important for you to be tasting the same wine. But again, some of the wines, in fact, I don't even tell you. Obviously, I have family who lives in Pennsylvania. And so I will go on their website and find out what's available and what's around. But like every place, our laws are so weird in the United States when it comes to alcohol. I mean, for example, when I do the work for putting this talk together, I have to tell them that I'm over 21 practically every time just to get information. And as I said, I can't drink the screen. Why? What difference does it make if I'm 21 or not if I'm asking questions about wine? But that's just the way it works in there. So I know that is in fact one of the problems in doing this, and to doing it for a wide audience is in fact getting wines, in fact, that are available to everyone. And so I certainly use one more thing to work on. But again, and I am open to suggestions. There's no questions about, fun topics and things to cover, because there's so many things, in fact, to cover when it comes to wine. Okay.
Yeah, and I hope you didn't take that as a slight. With I know how hard you
Oh
work
my
for
heavens,
finding
no,
these
no, I
wines.
understand.
So
Trust me, it
yeah,
bothers me like crazy when people can't find the wines. Because
yeah,
again, I want people to be there and enjoy themselves and to have life easy. Life should be, as there's too many things that are crappy in life. So
yeah.
few other
We
things
appreciate
going
it.
on.
So I know you have some pictures you want to
Yes.
show, so we can do that, and
Yep.
then once you're done, I'll close this out.
Okay, great. Yep. So let's see. First of all, I thought, in fact, some of you know, I, in fact, have decided I was going to be a marshal at graduation. And so I've got to get there nice and early. And so this is what the field looks like before anyone else is there. And again, we lucked out beautifully. It was a glorious morning. And so, in fact, this is what it looks like. I thought I would show you too before, because again, when I marshal, I don't have time, in fact, to take pictures, but beforehand, way beforehand, this, in fact, is our wonderful color guard practicing before anyone else got there. And so I took their picture again, because they, in fact, did a wonderful, wonderful job. And so it really, again, graduation, there's just a certain thing about it that is really so wonderful. And I thought I would show you some pictures. This, in fact, was my TA from last semester. He graduated, in fact, very, very well, as you can see, and in fact, already has a job, etc. So that was, in fact, a picture of he and I. This is another one. In fact, I just wrote her a letter of recommendation Association. She was also, in fact, I took lots of selfies. In fact, when I was there, those are my marshal's robes, and so you see me in my regalia there. In fact, with all of that, this in fact was a woman, in fact, who was in my wines class, who's just Maddie, just a lovely, lovely person. So she was sitting not very far from me, and so this is a picture I captured of her. And then I laughed. This is, of course, another guy, in fact, who was in wines class. He, of course, was taking the applause of, because I think he was, I don't know, magna cum laude or something like that. He was, of course, taking in the applause of everybody, in fact, who was in there. So I thought it was too funny to see. Students are just wonderful, and I enjoy every minute of all of them. Some other things going on. I thought some things going on around town. The Oxford Wine and Craft Beer Festival. I took this picture, in fact, today. The breeze made it difficult, but you can see that's what it is. It, in fact, is next Saturday, May 31st, from 2 to 10. And if you come up, I typically am handling I donate a case of wine, and I handle the premium pour tastings from 2 until 10. And so it makes for a long day, but I feel very good about this because all the wines are donated. So any wine that, in fact, I get tickets for are wines that go to the scholarship fund. And that is a wonderful thing that, in fact, the Oxford Chamber of Commerce does. I thought I would show you a few pictures. They are, in fact, again, you were probably in McGuffey at some point in time. They are renovating McGuffey. So I thought I would show you this picture. This, of course, is nothing better, a little twisted because I took it, in fact, from my car as I was driving. Those of you who are coming in, I know you can do it for the Psalms, etc., but there's a special thing about going through because they are renovating Bachelor Hall and changing it tremendously, which is probably a really good thing. And so I thought I would remind you, of course, of that. They, in fact, just started work on the Sustainability Park. Again, Sharon and Graham Mitchell, to lovely people and incredible alumni of Miami University, donated, in fact, the seed money, in fact, for this. It'll make over 2,000 kilowatt hours of sunlight, turning into electricity. And so that is a wonderful thing that they are doing there, in fact, over on Western Campus that's going on. I thought I would show you Cookfield just because I thought I would show you Cookfield. And also, too, I was thinking about this. If you come to, and of course, in many cases, they're blooming on Alumni Weekend, which, of course, as many of you should know, is in 2 weeks on the 7th, and basically the 7th on there. You will see many of these Japanese tree lilacs. And Art Conrad, who, in fact, the Formal Gardens, in fact, are named for. We are still living, in fact, off of what Art did. And one of his favorite trees was Japanese tree lilacs. And they are just coming into bloom all over campus. And they are just lovely. And so I thought I would share, since I was taking a picture close by, I would share with you one of those. And finally, even though I cringe every time I look at my own visage on this, in 2 weeks, of course, is the Performing Arts Wine Taster fundraiser, and that is from 2 to 5 at the Community Arts Center. And we will have many wonderful wines for you to come and taste. And I will be there, and I hope to see many of you there also. Okay? So, finally, thank you for Miami alumni, and have a great Memorial Day.
I was having trouble adding myself back to the screen there. So
what was that?
I said I was having a hard time adding myself back to the screen. So thank you to you, Jack, for sharing your time, your stories, everything about campus and your expertise with us. We also appreciate all of you who tuned in and submitted questions. We're so glad that you chose to. Yes, thank you. And I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question. We have a lot and we have a time limit. So thank you. We're so glad you chose to spend your evening with the Miami University Alumni Association. We hope that you had a great time and maybe even discovered a new favorite wine. So just a quick reminder to all of you that our webinars, both upcoming and previously recorded, are free and open to everyone. You can check them out anytime at alumlc.org/MiamiOH. We do kind of take a little bit of a break over the summer, but we will be right back in August with them. So with Memorial Day on Monday, I just want to say in memory of our fallen heroes, your sacrifice will never be forgotten. Thank you again, Jack. Thank you again to everyone who tuned in. Have a wonderful weekend. And as always, love and honor.